Hi, class. Uh, your first thought upon seeing me like this is probably like, what the hell? Uh, this is not how you are likely accustomed to seeing Dr. Cook. Um, and that's okay. So I'm sitting here, it's about 9 p.m., and I'm putting together the lecture on attribution. And a couple of my favorite things about attribution just aren't covered that well. Um, and I'm digging around on the internet and I just can't find what I'm looking for to really hit these pieces of attribution. So I thought, you know what? I'm just going to try to throw a lecture together. And full disclosure, I just finished a beer while I was doing that. Um, so the two pieces of attribution processes that I want to talk about that really aren't covered very well. I mean, they're briefly touched on in your book, but I couldn't find like a cool YouTube video or anything that explained them well. Are the discounting principle and the augmentation principle. And I think these are two processes of attribution that we use all the time and don't even really give it a second thought. So here's a perfect example of that. If you see me like this, still wearing the clothes that I wore to the gym a couple hours ago and didn't change out of, and you think, oh, this is really unprofessional. I am not going to listen to anything he has to say. You're discounting my performance. However, if you see me and you're like, look at this, he's dressed like a schlub. Uh, he just disclosed to us that he drank a beer with dinner, but he still sounds really intelligent. And I think I'm going to listen to what he has to say. Then you're augmenting my performance. So we do this when we're thinking about other people's performance. We do this when we're thinking about our own performances. And we do it all the time. So one perfect example that works really well for this, I think, is if you're a sports fan or you follow a sports team, when they drop the ball, like sometimes literally, right? When they do something terrible, you usually discount it, that they're having an off night, or the other way around. So I remember some years ago that Kobe Bryant scored 81 points in a basketball game. And I was a Kobe Bryant fan. I was so excited. And I wanted to like see highlights and hear what people had to say. And some commentators said things like, well, this is what happens when you have a good player and a bad defense. And that totally discounted his performance. He was only the second player in history to score that many points in a game. So they just discounted it because they didn't want to, say that Kobe Bryant did this wonderful thing. And we augment, for instance, like I'll use another basketball reference. In one of his most famous games ever, Michael Jordan played incredibly well, even though he had flu-like symptoms. They think he had food poisoning. And it's held up as one of his best performances, not because he scored the most points, not because it was even his best game, because he played terribly early on in the game and then he willed himself, through it. But rather because he played that well and they won the game, even though he had flu-like symptoms. That's augmenting his performance. Now, one of the really important things to know about our attributions is that we often display something we call the self-serving bias. When we're making attributions about behavior, our own behavior in particular, we tend to evaluate things in ways that makes us feel and look better. So for instance, if you failed the exam, you might discount it by saying, well, the questions were unfair. Um, it was really confusing. Plus, I had another exam and another class that day. Plus, I had to work so much that week. All of those different pieces you add to your explanation all discount your performance. Because now you can say, oh, I'm still really intelligent and I still know everything in this class. I just didn't do well because of all these factors. On the other hand, if you didn't study and you went out and partied, and yet you still did really well on the exam, you can augment your performance. You can say, I did this well, even though these other factors were going on. So, like, I'm brilliant. So, think about your own behaviors and how you make attributions about them. We often attribute poor performances to external factors, they're not our fault. And we give ourselves credit for our really great performances, especially when there are these other things going on that should have made us not perform quite as well. And that's the augmentation principle. One last thing to talk about. So we went through augmentation principle, discounting principle, and self-serving bias is the correspondence bias. So that self-serving bias that we have a tendency to use uh, when we're evaluating our own behaviors versus other people's behaviors, we call that the correspondence bias because we tend to attribute others' behavior solely to them as a person rather than any kind of external factor. And there are lots of reasons why we do that. I think primarily because we simply don't know the external factors that might have influenced their behavior. We can't know, but we know all of our external factors, right? Because of just the nature of being us. Um, the example that always comes to mind for me, and I think makes the most sense of it, is just imagine when you're driving, right? So if you're on the freeway and someone cuts you off, how do you respond? If you're anything like me, or sorry, if you're anything like people I've ridden with, then you're likely to say like, "Hey, that guy's an asshole," or "That person's an asshole." Doesn't have to be a guy. That person's an asshole. They cut me off. Um, but what happens when you cut somebody off? You had to, right? Like they weren't letting you over, even though you had a blinker on, or you're about to miss your exit because there was a semi there and you couldn't see the sign. So we take our behavior and evaluate it in terms of all the situational factors that caused it. And then we take the exact same behavior from someone else and say it's just simply because they're a bad person. So that's a personal distribution, a dispositional attribution, whereas for us, we make situational attributions. Um, I like to think when somebody's driving really poorly, instead of saying, oh, that person's like, they're inconsiderate or they're dangerous or anything like that, I like to think something along the lines of, well, maybe they just have to go to the bathroom really badly. And then I usually feel a little bit better about it. Okay, so to recap, there are lots of fun pieces of attributional research that I think can really highlight our understanding of how we all interpret the world around us and attribute cause and blame to other people and to ourselves. And so in this very brief video, I think I may have even kept it under 10 minutes. We talked about discounting principle, augmentation principle, self-serving bias, correspondence bias, dispositional attributions, and situational attributions. And those are some of the more kind of fun pieces, I think, to think about this stuff. Okay, next time you see me, I'll be dressed professionally. It won't be past 9 p.m. It'll probably be when we're in class. And therefore, you can take me seriously.